All right. All right. It's
All
all
right.
yours,
Hello,
Gong.
everyone, and your continued and participation. All right. Thanks, Andy. Good morning, everyone, or good evening, wherever you are. And thanks for continued interest and participations to ARMA, American Rock Mechanics Association, Hydraulic Fracturing Community Rope Talk Series. This is one of the volunteer efforts we are doing to serve members when everyone stay at home. Most people stay at home, and get entertained as well as stimulated, technically connected. Those things turns out very important, not only technically but also for our mental health as well. Reduce the pressure, stress, so on. I'm so grateful for all the speakers, volunteers. We had Sid Green and Mark Zobag in the past two talks. And for the Monday Mark's talk, we switched from WebEx to Zoom. Thanks Andy's last minute life-saving action. And today we are pleased to have Professor Andy Bunger from University of Pittsburgh to share his perspective on this objective optimizations of horizontal well completions. He's going to talk about the mechanics, reduced order model, and a case study. And Andy actually joined the University of Pittsburgh in 2013, about 7 years ago. Before that, he spent 10 years in Australia with the CSRO, and very prolific researcher with the geomechanics group. Prior to that, he received his PhD from University of Minnesota. His research interest includes the mechanics of hydraulic fractures, coupled fluid shear interactions, implement of dynamics of magma-driven dikes and seals, and development of novel materials for well bowl, cementing, and plugging. Before I turn the mic to Andy, I ask everyone to mute themselves. Probably Andy already helped mute all the voices to avoid echo. If you have questions, please hold until the end of the presentation. We have 30 minutes for presentation, 15 minutes for Q&A. You can type your questions into the chat window, and Andy will address them accordingly. Another choice is that you can always send the email to Andy or myself. I will forward to Andy after the presentation. I'm sure Andy will follow up those questions as well. So another thing to remind everybody, this meeting is recorded, and Andy is very kindly willing to share not only the presentation, this time is a recorded video to anyone who might want to follow up or have missed this presentation. We will announce the new and oncoming hydraulic fracturing newsletter. The newsletter not by this weekend. You probably need the hydraulic fracturing community newsletter. Regularly we send out the technologies and announcement. So to Andy, feel free to take over.
All right. Well, very good. Well, thank you so much, Gong, for instigating this series. You know, and when we were all moving our offices back home a few weeks ago, I was thinking what a great thing it would be if we could get together and do this. And so when Gong came forward with the opportunity, I was really happy to be a part of it. I know, you know, it's something that we do. This is one of the ways that we share. We have community. I can see the names on here. I think we'd have a fantastic lunch afterward if we were allowed to. We'd have a lot of fun. But this is what we're doing for now, and really looking forward to hopefully a nice lunch together at a hydraulic fracturing workshop at an ARMA meeting in the future. So what I want to talk about today is a topic that has largely grown out of work by my student Chang, whose dissertation is really aimed at trying to come up with minimalist hydraulic fracture models, like pairing out as many pieces as we can systematically and seeing, you know, how kind of lightweight of a reduced order model can we use in order to still capture essentials of hydraulic fracture growth. And I'm also going to be relying on some lab work of my student Dalal Ganaiden, and some simulations that came from my collaborator from the University of British Columbia, Anthony Pierce. And so the context, of course, is this issue of horizontal well completions. Of course, the concept that we have is that we'd like to create a multitude of hydraulic fractures along a horizontal well bore. And as was sketched in some of the earliest days of really taking seriously this idea of bringing together directional drilling and hydraulic fracturing, we'd love for those hydraulic fractures to be as uniform as possible. And there's also a number of other issues, like how close to put them together from a perspective of production, how, you know, and all of these things have kind of touched off this thrust of research over the last, I don't know, maybe 15 years-ish, where there's been a lot of talk about how to optimize horizontal well completions. So the idea is, I'm putting optimize in quotes because it means different things to different people. We're going to talk about that later. But the idea is to optimize via choice of completion parameters. Now, there are some challenges in this. So one of the challenges is that the mechanics of hydraulic fractures growing at the same time near one another are kind of complicated. You have this creation of, you know, induced stresses around the hydraulic fractures. They interact with one another. You can see results from experiments from Dalal showing this phenomenon that's been predicted for quite a while by models, where the central fractures are suppressed due to what's been come to be known as stress shadowing from the outer fractures. And so capturing this in models can lead to something which is quite computationally intense. You have multiple moving boundaries. You have the way that the elasticity and fluid flow equations coupled together lead to a system of equations that can be challenging from the perspective of numerical stability and a number of other computational issues. And so oftentimes these models are pretty computationally intense. Now, that's you know, that's a problem at one level that you can solve by getting the models down to computing within a few hours, and you can kind of deal with it from a design, you know, of a given treatment perspective. But if you're interested in doing optimization, what you usually have to do is run a forward model many, many, many times if you're going to explore some objective function. And so something like optimization, or another really important area, which I won't talk about today, but is related, is uncertainty quantification. Again, those are cases where you find the need to run your forward model many, many, many times, maybe thousands of times. And so there, even getting your simulator down to running within hours, multiplied by thousands or tens of thousands, leads to a task that is almost insurmountable. And then the final point I want to talk about today is there's more than one objective in the optimization. And so all of those things put together make this question of optimization complicated. And so I want to talk today about kind of a three-pronged approach at this issue of optimization. It's going to start with hydraulic fracture mechanics and just a few observations from you know, a variety of different contributions over recent years. So one of them is, you know, this recognition that there's stress shadowing. As hydraulic fractures grow, they can suppress the growth of other fractures. This is not an exhaustive list. Things also like that hydraulic fractures are sensitive to variability in the in situ properties. For example, if you vary the stresses from one perforation cluster to another, that can have a major impact on the propensity of given hydraulic fractures to grow. That's like one of the underpinning mechanical observations for things like engineered completions, where, you know, you try to place clusters in locations of similar stresses, that kind of thing. Another observation is that while there's a lot to be said for high fidelity models, and there's many different brands of models, what one can observe is that, you know, if you balance, if you get mass balance right, you account for fluid flow elasticity and crack propagation. If you get those ingredients put together correctly, most of those models that get those parts right perform reasonably well. The problem is pretty well regulated by its mass, by its fluid mass balance, by the compliance of the rock, by fluid flow equations. And so if we can get some essential ingredients together, maybe we can come up with a model that won't be super high fidelity, but maybe it will get some essential parts and do it in a way that's pretty fast. And then as we think about translating hydraulic fracture simulation into production modeling, there's there's some observation, some suggestion that production models that use kind of similar propped fracture areas, there's of course limitations on this, but you know, if you get a similar propped fracture area in a similar formation, you get kind of a similar prediction for your production rate. And so the idea is to take a kind of fast coupling of the minimum number of model ingredients, the minimum complexity that we can handle, and still kind of hope to capture some essence. Put that together into a computational mechanics framework that will allow us to come out with some prediction of production rate over time. That's the first goal. And then we're going to deploy that. It's hopefully fast. And so we can deploy it in order to do optimization that requires thousands, tens of thousands of forward model evaluations. So this is sort of a generic framework in a sense of how a hydraulic fracture to production model works. So probably just about any modeling framework that tries to put these pieces together will have something of this effect. So you input rock properties, completion properties, and you first run a hydraulic fracture simulator that outputs fracture geometry. So then you pull out of that the things that your production model believes to be important for production, things like propped fracture area, fracture width could be relevant to the fracture conductivity, things like that. And then that gets passed into some kind of production model. And you can do this in a high fidelity way. You can get all first principles stuff in there. There's a number of approaches that are currently being worked on. People have, that have been very valuable over the years. What the aim is here is to do this very, very quickly. And in fact, if you take what we've arrived at is hopefully kind of our minimal complexity model. Maybe there isn't enough complexity in it yet, but at least it can handle apparently some cases. We can do this pretty quickly, say 5 stages in a second on a typical PC. Computational intensity for high fidelity models varies. You'd probably guess it to be in the order of, minimally tens of minutes, probably hours to days, depending on your high fidelity model to do this process. So it's a huge speed up. There is some loss of fidelity, but maybe it'll be good enough and we can calibrate it out. That's what we'll see in a few minutes. It's pretty easy to include things like perforation, friction, so you can have limited entry considerations, that kind of thing, and things like stress variation along the wellbore. High fidelity models, fully coupled simulations are super valuable. They're useful in immediately for benchmarking these low fidelity approximate simulators. And then field data is also super valuable, which is sometimes hard to come by. We're very thankful to the MSEAL project, and hopefully in the near future we'll be able to get hands on other DOE-sponsored data and work with it. That field data is super important. So just to kind of work backwards then from the production model, and this is kind of a maybe overly simplified view of production, but let's just kind of build it up. So if you have like the kind of simplest thing you can think of doing, where you say you have linear flow, just following a kind of linear diffusion law, and an infinite fracture conductivity, you end up with a production that's proportional to the propped area and the square root of the permeability of the formation. You could do some kind of calibration with some kind of coefficient if you wanted to. You could then say, well, I don't think the flow is exactly linear. I'm going to allow the exponents to be variable and kind of fit those to some data. And then you could even bump up a little bit more and say, well, if we have the driving pressure of the flow back to the well related somehow effectively to fracture conductivity, we can bump in something related to fracture width and the proppant size, things like that. And so you end up with a relationship which is kind of inspired by the underlying formula, but that has coefficients that you can twiddle around to try to match your model to data. And it accounts for things like, calibrating in a certain locality. Maybe there's some secondary fractures that get stimulated that don't get counted in your model's prediction of propped area, but it's typically proportional to the propped area. And so those kinds of things that can be very hard to predict, kind of ab initio type prediction, you can, kind of wave your hands at and try to calibrate out if you've got some data to complement your model prediction. So then the role then of the hydraulic fracture model comes to be to predict these things like propped area, fracture width, so we can plug those into the production model, calibrate the production model to data, and hopefully get something that gives a useful prediction in fairly quick time. So here's the fracture model. So the basic idea is to find something that gives an equivalent or something proportional to propped fracture area. I haven't gotten a chance to write up the publication on this yet. I'll explain in some detail eventually. There is some similarity to the model of my student, Cheng with the reference shown here. But the model I'm using is actually even lower fidelity than Cheng's. But it basically accounts for the growth of hydraulic fractures. We're limiting here to radial growth. There's stress interaction between them. There's the inlet pressure loss associated with the perforations. We put that stuff in, and then we can benchmark. So here's one example of a benchmark problem where we inject to 5 perforation clusters. So we're looking at the side here. And the high fidelity model gives a sort of, I guess, what's come to be a fairly classical result in a sense, where the influx rate to each fracture starts out being equal, but very quickly bifurcates, and the outer fractures get almost all of the flow, and the inner fractures get suppressed. And so after a little while, there's very, very little growth of the inner fractures. So we can see the outer fractures in this simulation grow to 35 meters, and the inner fractures grow to only about 10 meters. And so the rapid model results are able to sort of grasp this grasp it roughly. You can see the dominance of the outer fractures, suppression of inner fractures, and the lengths or the radii of each fracture is captured reasonably well. And so the behavior of the model then looks something like this, just to give an idea, what sort of impacts the model. If we consider a horizontal well with, I think here, this sample case is 24 stages with 4 clusters per stage. If we have no perforation friction and no random variability of stresses, no stress shadow from previous stages, we get this view that the outer fractures in each stage dominate quite heavily over the central fractures in each stage. That's a consequence of stress shadow. Now, if we keep the same, everything else the same, but we put in the previous stage stress shadow, you can see that the heel cluster in each stage, where the stresses are, so we're completing from toe to heel. So say when this stage is created, the compressive stress acting on the toe cluster is higher than on the heel cluster. So the toe cluster grows less than the fracture from the heel cluster. So you see this bias towards the heel within the stage because of the stresses from previous stages. Now what's interesting and sort of shocking in some sense is, you do all of that work to try to be super accurate in the modeling, but then if you say, well, I've carried out some well logs, and based on those well logs, we've interpreted those for elastic properties, and then in turn used a geomechanical model, interpreted those for stress. And I can see my stress is varying. And let's say it varies by like 10%. So I'm going to plug in that 10% variability in the stress, and what you can see is that that variability of the stress has a huge impact. So if you look statistically over a whole bunch of stages, there still is a bias towards the heel. There still is statistically a bias towards the outer clusters in the stage, but there's a lot of random stuff happening. And here, this is just, I haven't even, explicitly varied other mechanical properties, and we haven't even gone to the point of varying, like the permeability as you go into production. So you can see the variability has a huge effect. Still there's dominance again of the outer clusters, but it's now statistical, not just clean deterministic. If you don't like all that variability, you can do what operators do and have been increasingly doing over recent years, is to crank up the perforation friction. So that obviously comes with a price. You have higher perforation pressures. You may be bumping up against the limits in the pressure rating of your wellhead, all those kinds of things. But to the extent that you're able to accommodate it operationally and economically, you crank up that perf friction to a point where the pressure loss across the perforations kind of overwhelms that variability of the stresses, and you can really even out the distribution of fluid. So that's the type of stuff that is captured in this sort of model. So now we want to use the model, and the idea is going to be to calibrate this model using data from existing wells. I'm going to use the publicly available data from the DOE MCO well, which is a 4-well pad in the Marcellus Formation near Morgantown. Fantastic data set. I saw Tim Carr was on the line. Really appreciate all that data being available, and it's really helpful to those of us who are, we don't work for operators, so it's very hard for us to get our hands on detailed data sets. And then I'm going to use that model for optimization and talk about what to do about multiple objectives in this optimization. Okay, so the MCL project, really the key thing for us in using it is that there are several completion approaches. The most variability in completion approaches occurs in well number 3. So well 3 and 5 are more recent. There are legacy wells numbered 4 and 6 that were completed several years earlier before this project. And well 3 is kind of nice because it's got a production log. And if you look at this is well 3, and you look at, so this is just as each dot is a stage. and this is a location along the lateral in feet. You can see the stages have varying amounts of fluid, proppant, types of proppant, fluid viscosities, number of perforation holes per cluster. Like if you're in factory mode and you're doing the same thing every stage, each of these graphs is like a straight line. But here we have a variety of things that are being done, and we've got a production log. So that opens up a possibility to do calibration with a single well that could be done if we wouldn't need production logs, but we would need like a few wells in the same region where different types of completions have been carried out. But this well, because of the kind of richness of what was carried out there, allows us to do a calibration on the single well. Also, it would be really nice to have like simple, clear correlations between like what was done here and production. I've looked for simple correlations. I haven't been very successful. I know there's others who've employed more sophisticated machinery, and I'm sure Tim could fill us in on status of that. I was not able to find sort of simple correlations between what was done in a stage and the production. But what we were able to do is taking all those details of every single stage, the completion report, number of clusters per stage, spacing, the volume of fluid, the proppant, all of that. We're able to go stage by stage and cluster by cluster and predict the propped area for every cluster. And you can see that varies stage by stage because different things are being done on every stage. But you can see this model, and it's giving us some kind of prediction. And then that plus the width we can put into a production model and then try to calibrate that production model. So on a given day, if we've calibrated the production model right, we can come out with something like a predicted gas rate per cluster. So in well 3, we know this, or at least we have a measurement that is hopefully reasonably closely related to the production per stage on a given day. This was like a year after the well was put on production. And so we can come up with a predicted production per stage, and we have a measured, and we can use that to choose calibration constants in the production model so as to get the best match we can. And when we do that, we can go through and get predictions of what we think the other wells would have produced were we to have a production log on the same day, same timing into the production history. You can see this well 5, this was completed in a factory mode. The variation of the production here is more related to the permeability, which I ascertained from the early time fall off of the pressure from the shut-in pressures at each stage. And then these are the legacy wells, which you can see are shorter, fewer stages, less intensively completed. So if we then go to our calibration, so the calibration gives us the production rate on a given day. And so this red line would be the production we would get. Now we know that production doesn't just sit at a constant rate, right? It falls off with time. I would have, my preference would have been to calibrate this whole fall off curve with data from just well 3, but unfortunately by the time well 3 was on production, the operator was kind of dictated to by some regulations that they had to manage this well seasonally. So the well is being at least partially shut in during summer months and opened wider during winter. So what I did instead was went to the legacy well. So well 4 has a production history where it was allowed to fall off more naturally. So I calibrated well 4 I predicted well 4 without further calibration at like 1 year into production, and then I fitted basically a generalized hyperbolic production decay law to well 4. And we can see well 5, it's a little bit harder to ascertain whether we did a good job because of the well being managed seasonally. But well 6, with no further calibration, we're able to pretty much predict the production decline. And that allows us to do things like predict like a 500-day EUR, or whatever your favorite, whatever we choose as our favorite metric of production, we can pull that off from that predicted production decline curve. So that allows us to input, different completion properties, different rock properties, have an intermediate output of propped area, propped width. That goes into this calibrated production model, and then that gives us some kind of metric of production. Okay, so we've kind of arrived at the end of the computational mechanics piece. And so the idea now will be, there's no sense in doing, this fast modeling. I wouldn't use it for detailed design. That's not its purpose. You don't need a super fast model to do your detailed design or to do detailed science project, that type of thing. What it can let us do is things like optimization and uncertainty quantification. So let's employ it for the thing it's fit for purpose to do. And the key here the key point, I think, to the optimization is something that I think those of us in the mechanics community, at least I speak for myself, we sometimes resist thinking about both of these optimization points because we like mechanics. So we like this objective 1, which is to produce as much as possible, because we can work out a model that can predict production based on completions, and that's a mechanical connection, so we like that because we're mechanics people. The only thing is that the actual problem itself has a second objective, which is essentially at odds with the first objective, which is to spend as little as possible. Now, there are people within every company who live and breathe this objective, right? Do this as inexpensively as possible. And these two things get held in tension with one another. So what I actually am going to do is include in my model that my completion not only predicts production, but I'm going to use published data. Again, if I was at an operator, I could use detailed cost model, because operators typically know their cost model pretty well. I used a data-driven cost model that's published from EIA because for me in academia, that was the data that I could get my hands on. So then we have to look at how do we handle the fact that there's two objectives. So we take a step back. What do we do when we've got a multi-criteria optimization? We firstly have to recognize that it is distinctly different from single criterion optimization. Single criterion optimization, you come up with a kind of fitness function, and you come up with some search method to find where you find an optimal location within that fitness function. When you have multiple criteria, it's tricky. And actually, a lot of engineering problems are multiple criteria problems. So here we're trying to produce as much as possible and spend as little as possible. They're in tension with each other. We have the same sort of thing if we were mechanical engineers designing a car. We want it to go as fast as possible, but be the cheapest in our price, in our given price range or whatever. So there's always this trade-off, and we can choose, on the one hand, to just optimize what we think is the most important. It's actually kind of a common approach, especially if you're thinking just reduce cost. I know everybody has on our minds right now, reduce cost. So we're just going to, by optimize, we mean we're just going to make our wells cheaper. In times where oil or gas are more expensive, we can just think, just make our wells produce more. But sometimes the true optima can kind of hide from us if we only do that. We can also construct weighted combinations, ratios. Those can have, you can say Well, I'm going to add the cost plus the, or I'm going to take like the revenue I think I could generate, subtract the cost, adjust that for time. You come up with something like a net present value, which those are fine for what they do, but they do sometimes change the problem depending on kind of ad hoc weights that you have to choose. Another way is to explicitly allow for the multiple objectives and explore a higher dimensional objective space. That's what we're going to do. And I want to argue that in our case, if we don't account for the interplay between the competing objectives, more production and less cost, what we inevitably arrive to is what I would call our kind of one-dimensional solutions. So the first one-dimensional solution is that bigger is better. If we do not consider the second objective of minimizing cost, just drill the well longer, make more stages, put more clusters per stage, like just go bigger, 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 bigger. And there's nothing stopping us from doing that if we don't consider the second objective. The other option is that we just go cheaper is better. And we just cut costs. Just, you know, say to the asset team, cut your cost by 20%. We don't care how you do it. But there actually is a way to do this more rationally. So the machinery to do this will be familiar to some and maybe not as familiar to others depending on your background. Some areas of engineering live and breathe this. Other areas, you know, we don't teach it as much. So just a little bit of terminology and approach. So what we're going to do is create a cross plot of our two objectives. If we had more objectives, we could create a higher dimensional cross plot. I'm just going to do these two objectives. So the first objective is my estimated ultimate recovery. And I'm going to normalize it by the EUR for the base case. So in this case, this was MCO well number 3. So at 1, that is the EUR, I think I took 500 day for the MCO well 3. And then I took cost and divided by cost of the base case. I didn't know the cost of MCO well 3, but I used my cost model. So its approximate cost is here at 1. So the 1 point is my base case. And then what I do is I run a whole bunch of realizations of my forward model. So in this example, I'm fixing rock properties, lateral length, proppant size, and concentration, but I'm varying number of stages, number of clusters per stage, number of perf holes per cluster, which changes the pressure drop through the perforations, fluid viscosity, pumping rate, pumping time. You can see like several of these, like they all have impacts on how much you produce. You use more stages, you're going to produce more, but it costs you more. There's a cost penalty. And so all those things play together to give each simulation its own predicted EUR and its own predicted cost. So one simulation gives us 1 point. So then we end up with this collection of a whole bunch of points just by randomly selecting cases within a range that we're willing to allow the completion parameters to vary. I could also have varied the length of the lateral, which I do in a future example here. And that whole collection of points is called the feasibility set. Now you'll notice these little jumps. Those are because there's a cost penalty every time we go over certain thresholds in the pressure at the wellhead. So if you go over a typical 10,000 PSI wellhead limitation, you've got to pay money. Each time you go higher and higher, there's a cost penalty. So that's what these kind of discrete jumps are indicating. But what is most interesting and important here is this group that is circled. So I'm just circling cases that live on the frontier of this feasibility set. And that frontier is called the Pareto frontier. Or these cases are considered Pareto optimal, and they're special because if you are at a case here on the Pareto front, you can only produce more. Like the only way to go to higher production is to also go to higher cost. Now, anything that's off the Pareto front, somewhere down here, you can actually at the same cost change the way you complete the well and produce more at that same cost. But on the Pareto front, you have to spend more. Like you're absolutely doing the most you can at that particular cost point. And on the flip side, if you want to say reduce cost, you have to deal with a reduction in production. So in other words, you are absolutely getting the most production out of the invested cost if you're in a case along the Pareto front. Our job as engineers is to identify this Pareto front, I would argue. And then our managers who deal with money can decide how much they're willing to spend, and they can choose which case we say along the Pareto front. But as engineers, I think it's valuable to have a family of solutions. They're all different from each other, but they all represent the most efficient use of the resources that are being invested. And while it seems kind of managerial because it's got cost, remember the whole connection is coming via mechanics. Okay, so then we have choices like, you know, where do we want to sit? Do we want to drill more wells that are less expensive, fewer wells with greater investment? You can kind of see something interesting that, you know, there's a steep slope. So when the slope is steep of the Pareto front, that's where a little increase in investment can make a much bigger impact on the production. When the slope becomes less, you're hitting the point of diminishing returns. You spend more, but you really don't get much increase in production. So, you know, you certainly don't want to get out into these zones of cases. Even if they're Pareto efficient, it's still like hitting the point of diminished return. So just as an example, and I'm just about to wrap up and take a few questions. So now if I let the lateral length vary and all the other things within the stage vary. So I allow myself different number of stages in the well, different clusters, different lateral length, different injection rate, different injection time, different viscosity, a different allowed predicted wellhead pressure. So this is my base case for MCO well 3, sits here at the 1,1 point. And you can see it's actually not far off from the Pareto front. It's not a bad design. There could be a few little tweaks at that cost point, but not bad. Now what we find is that if we say, well, we want to really go for it and get right up here to the edge of diminishing returns, what we can do is actually increase the lateral length up to sort of the kind of doubling the lateral length. More stages, fewer clusters per stage, but within reason. If you go too many stages, too many clusters per stage, the cost penalties drive you down here away from the Pareto front. And even allowing a little bit higher inlet or wellhead pressure, paying the price to have a higher rating of treating iron and wellhead seems to pay off in this case. So this is an example of kind of the direction one might go. Now in a kind of now more mature basin like the Marcellus, what's kind of interesting to see is that if you look at how completion practice has occurred over the past 10 years and a bit in the Marcellus, there's been kind of a progress from down here, shorter wells, lower intensity completions, towards now where people are routinely drilling 2-mile laterals in the Marcellus. So there's been this movement in this direction, and I think in a mature basin like this, it kind of is sort of a reality check on this type of model. Now that was done over a period of 10, 12 years with very expensive iterative approach. You know, you're spending millions of dollars per well to get each point. I think that the usefulness of this type of approach would be to help guide especially more emerging basins, trying to get up that learning curve more quickly. Another way that it could be useful is, you know, we've sort of been driving towards higher production. Now, if we are entering a reality where the goal is really to reduce cost with minimal impact on production, that's kind of a regime that we haven't tried to optimize that much. We don't have as many, or maybe we do, and it's not as published or in the mechanics community, but I think trying to minimize impact on production associated with a reduction of cost that's mandated by business considerations could be another way to utilize this sort of model. Okay, so to conclude, basically the optimizing integrates hydraulic fracture mechanics, trying to look at a minimal model to put together in a computational mechanics framework, and then optimizing in a Pareto sense, accounting explicitly for the multiple criteria. I think looking for things like Pareto optimality is kind of useful because it allows us as modelers to present a landscape of efficient solutions. Essentially, even though it looks business-like, it actually takes the business decision off from our plates. Lets us say, here's the landscape of efficient solutions. Business people can now go, do what they need to do. And I finally want to say, the model is, this model is it's rough. Like, it's intended to be kind of the roughest model we can stomach and that we can kind of find to benchmark well enough to be useful. But this kind of reduced order modeling certainly doesn't replace high fidelity modeling. I would argue that an appropriate use would be, for example, once one has identified a region of interest, you would never do design using a rough reduced order model like this. So now we can say to higher fidelity models, hey, it's kind of interesting to look at these type of properties. Why don't you go run 10 cases, around this area and see what we get out of a higher fidelity model. But now the higher fidelity model doesn't have to waste its time with cases that are not going to be optimal. And that's how I think ROM modeling and high fidelity modeling can work together synergistically going forward in the context of this complicated problem of optimizing completions. And I think with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Andy. I think this is fantastic. This is very enlightening. Make my head spinning start. But for the folks, as I mentioned at the beginning, this presentation is recorded, and we will release this video in the upcoming hydraulic fracturing newsletter announcement this weekend. So if you are not on that email list yet, feel free to send me an email. And also, yeah, this is a question session, but in lieu of the time, we limit probably 5 minutes question, if that's okay with Andy. And for the question that we don't have time to answer in this call, feel free to send Andy an email or myself an email. I will forward to Andy. He will be following up. So feel free to type your questions, and Andy, feel free to take over.
All right. First, I'll handle the comment from Ed Siebretz. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that you could plot production versus profit rather than cost. I've played around with other things like net present value and things like that. It tends to kind of stretch the space and morph it into a different shape. But the cases that are selected on the Pareto front, in the way, I mean, I haven't looked directly at profit, I've looked at NPV. The cases that are selected as Pareto efficient don't change much. Moving to Colin Sayers' question about in the Marcellus, we know that there's contributions from natural fractures that are remobilized around kind of maybe a main fracture. I think that's a really good question. And what I think is happening here, so, the reason I called the model echidna is because an echidna is a creature that I'm sort of amazed that it actually works. And it's a weird creature. And I'm kind of amazed that it actually works when you calibrate it to the data. And my best explanation for why it might work is I think that somehow the contribution of those secondary shear stimulated fractures scales somehow in proportion to, or at least as a power law of, the propped surface area. So if the propped surface area of the main fracture is somehow, proportional to the, the total stimulated area, if you consider also contribution of secondary fractures, then the whole thing gets kind of washed out in the calibration. But that, of course, means that it's quite locally specific. You calibrate in a locality, and you would never pick up the model that you calibrated for the Marcellus and carry it down to the Permian. You would get calibration wells in the Permian, for example. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anything that came in between. Alexander's son. Yes, most of the model trials are not near the Pareto envelope. Can you elaborate which parameters are more important for experimental design? So things that are typically quite bad in this case, but could be better in other cases. I'll say that especially for the sake of our operators who work in the Permian. So in this case, my base case, I was really close to 10,000 PSI to start with. So as soon as I went to many, many clusters per stage, this is just an example. If I did like 10 clusters per stage, I had very little ceiling to work with as far as putting in limited entry in order to ensure uniform distribution among those clusters without like knocking it over and spending a lot more money on the penalty for too high of a pressure. So in this case, many clusters per stage go way off from the Pareto front because I couldn't also put in the limited entry because my pressures were already so close to 10,000 PSI. Now in other basins, other situations, that could be totally different. And so that's all with a caveat that I think in different basins you could see very different behaviors plotting near that Pareto front. Yes, Xiaowei Wang, have you tried experiments with near wellbore restriction to mimic limited entry? What's your view on instability due to fracs wanting to avoid each other and how to take this uncertainty into account? So, so I do have limited entry already there. That is within the model experiments. I don't know if that's numerical or lab experiments. Yeah, so I think what I will comment on is the uncertainty. I think there's some really interesting stuff. My student is working on this right now. What's very interesting is if you put in uncertainty in a variety of senses. So you could have uncertainty in the number of perf holes per cluster that are flowing, for example, even during stimulation. That would kind of be like an uncertainty in near wellbore tortuosity. You have uncertainty in rock properties, all of that. What's really interesting is that some completions give a much higher variance on the expected outcome. So if you run with a distribution of possible cases that are based on that variable, inlet friction and stuff like that, you actually get different variances on the expected outcome for different completions. Some completions are much more robust than others to those uncertainties. And that's something that's really interesting that one can play around with a very fast model, because you need to be able to do tens of thousands of realizations to do that uncertainty quantification. It's being respectful of people's time. I know some people will need to drop off, but I'm happy to try to get through as many of these as I can. From James Rogerson, is it possible to consider impact of diversion strategies with the model? I think yes. Yeah, it would come in. Yeah, there's a place for it. It would come in the algorithm that decides how the fluid is partitioned. You would basically have a penalty function that's related to the volume of flow that's gone through that cluster. And so you could have a kind of diversion strategy built in that way. I haven't tried to do it or thought in detail about it, but I don't see any major hang-ups in trying to do it.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah.
Thanks. I know that seems more questions are listed in the chat window. Are you able to? Yeah, you mentioned earlier you can output the chat window, right?
Yeah, I can send the chat window to you, and you can distribute it if you'd like.
What I'm suggesting is that for those questions we don't have time to answer in this phone call, because you type the question in the chat window, and we'll be able to see it and follow up probably after this phone call.
Yeah, I'm fine with that, unless the askers of the question would like to stay on the line. Anyone who needs to go can come back and watch. But I mean, I think it's, in some sense, I can handle them fairly efficiently now. Just sort of with our blessing, those who need to sign off can sign off.
Yes, that's actually much better. For the folks who want to stay in this meeting, feel free to stay with Andy. For the folks who needs to leave, feel free to leave. As I mentioned, we will release the video in the hydraulic fracturing newsletter. And if you have not received by this weekend, you're probably not on that email list. This series at the beginning, we are intended to serve the hydraulic fracturing community member, which is basically the community is free to anyone who is interested in hydraulic fracturing. And along the road, we took suggestions from the members that open up to anyone, even the people who are not the members. However, if you want to receive the newsletter, you have to be a hydraulic fracturing member. All it takes is send me an email, okay? Other than that, I leave the room to Andy. And for the rest of folks, next week, we're gonna have Mark McCullough from ResFrac. He's gonna share his studies on the plenary fracture development. And after that, we have Gary Couples from Heliowald University in Scotland. We are blessed to have him share the Best Paper Award from the AAPG recent publications. So having said that, and I wish everybody stay healthy, stay safe, be mindful, try to avoid good crowds, be around the crowds, and we see you next week, okay? Andy, feel free to stay, okay?
Sure, no problem. Thanks, Gong.
All right.
All right. Yeah, Chang-Ho Lee, yeah, good question. Will DFIT analysis help calibration of the mechanical model in the ballpark? Yeah, so DFIT can be really handy. And just to sort of further, reveal what's going on. So actually, on a stage-by-stage basis, I'm doing like a mini rough DFIT because the services provider was nice enough to give ISIP 5-minute, 10-minute, 15-minute shut-in pressures. And so I'm able to get basically like a P-star type of slope like you would out of a DFIT on a stage-by-stage basis. And that turns out to be super helpful when it comes to getting that calibration right, because indeed the permeability that is embodied in that DFIT data is super important to the production model. Xiaocheng Wang, reduced HF model, are you using proxy model consist of empirical correction factors? So it's a true physical, it's a physics-based model. So it's not a proxy model, and there's no like, there's no like artificial intelligence or machine learning, nothing like that in it. The hydraulic fracture model itself is a physics-based model, but on a very simplified geometry. I think I'm working on generalizing it to handle things like, blade-shaped growth with some asymmetry up and down, things like that. But right now the model is like radial fractures, and just trying to use an equivalent propped area. And it's not necessarily to say that the fracture is radial. It's to say that the propped area that you get out of that model is proportional to the right answer. That's really all that matters in the end. But it is a physics-based hydraulic fracture model with things like lubrication theory, lubrication flow, elasticity, mass balance, that type of thing. I think we are almost to the end. Oh, have you ever tried to use this fast model to try and calibrate against, say, microseismicity? Yes, there is microseismicity from well 3, and I have a slide on that I didn't include in here for the sake of time. The jury is still kind of out for me as far as, you know, like as you do a stage by stage calibration, you know, do you get something that simply correlates to things like the microseismicity, microseismic inferred length, or microseismic inferred stimulated reservoir volume, or even things like B values or stuff like that? I was not able to, like, you know, I didn't look at it for a very long time, hours, maybe a day or two. And I couldn't pull anything really definitive out in that amount of looking. There might be something hiding in there, but I didn't, there's nothing like that jumps out as low-hanging fruit, but it is an interesting thing to continue looking at, especially as we have wells that have these rich data sets that include microseismicity. I think that is all the questions that have come in. Forgive me if I've missed anything. Appreciate everybody being here. Happy to take any more questions if you want to hang out. But yeah, this has been really enjoyable. So thank you so much for coming, and we'll talk to you soon.